work of a lot of our centers, including ours, the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, where we think about how data, design, and technology can have positive impacts on society. All the different centers and institutes on campus participating are hosting events like these. You can find out more on the Tech and Society website. There's a great QR code in the lobby out there. We hope you'll join us for more events like this, and we hope you'll come back every year and maybe suggest events to partner with us on. But today we'll be digging into, again, how Congress is moving its way into the present, into the 21st century, and itself using tools like data, technology, and design to deliver better outcomes to the American people. Our fellow Lorelei Kelly has been working on these issues for years, maybe decades, and has really made this her life's work with us at the Beck Center. We're delighted today to welcome some colleagues who are spending time currently in government, actually fighting these battles, to talk to us about what they're seeing and hearing and where we see some bright spots and challenges on the horizon. So please join me in welcoming Lorelei and our guests today. Thank you.
Just a quick housekeeping. We have hashtag Congress Arrives, and since we only have an hour, if we don't get to Q&A, please tweet questions, comments, share information, and then we'll try to respond. Instead of introducing everyone with a long bio, I'm going to let everyone sort of introduce themselves in the course of the conversation. The other thing we have is a live stream. Hello, live stream audience. Please tweet at us, and this will be archived so folks can look at it later. So one of the things I wanted to do, first of all, before we start, because this is just a group of people who've been working together on Congress, is let's give Congress, the institution, a hand. It's about the institution of Congress, and that's what we're going to be addressing here today. So the House Digital Service, which is in the title of this convening today, it's the marquee achievement of many years of collaboration to bring Congress into today's tech and data-savvy world. Over the years, and yes, in my case, decades, each of us in our own individual capacity has supported this institutional evolution. And since 2019, the House Select Committee on Modernization has really been the center of gravity of our efforts, with over 140 recommendations passed and 75% of those implemented from the last Congress. This committee has achieved just unprecedented progress, and it's transformed the internal workings of the House so that the institution itself can compete in today's volatile and rapidly changing public arena. I'm not talking here either about AI or blockchain. The changes that I'm talking about are very basic workflow elements. Congress has moved from hot lead type to e-signatures, for example, from 3-ring binders to Zoom, and now a digital service. So why are these basic workflow improvements so important? What promises do these changes mean for our future and for our democracy? So I'm going to ask everyone to identify themselves in the course of the first question, and I'll show you what I mean. I'm Lorelei Kelly. I've worked in and around Congress for the past 20 years building capacity inside the institution. My favorite example of a positive change today is Congress having changed the rules to take its committee functions online as an emergency measure during COVID. Now the entire United States is a potential bench of witnesses for hearings. This influential access point to the official record used to really require physical presence in DC, so that era is over. Just an example of this, I was home in northern New Mexico on a horse farm for a lot of the pandemic, and I met 2 other people besides myself who had testified in front of subcommittees in the hardware store, which is this tiny town called Aztec, New Mexico in San Juan County. I had testified on continuity of Congress. One friend who was a rancher had testified on methane gas wells abandoned on his grazing land, and another had testified on Navajo children education during the pandemic and equipping the reservation to get Wi-Fi. So that's an example. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Marcy, Ken, Liesl, and Devika, and they'll do the same.
Okay. So I also applaud the recent development of virtual hearings. As Lorelei said, it's a great equalizer. You used to have to pay for your own ticket to come to Washington to testify, and it had, impact on the equity of whose voices were heard in those hearings. So I'm Marcy Harris. I'm a former congressional staffer. I am the co-founder of Popbox, which is a tech platform that helps people connect with lawmakers. And most recently, we founded a nonprofit called the Popbox Foundation that works more closely with congressional staff and others to really hold these conversations about modernization and public engagement and connecting the public with Congress. And I'm honored to be with folks I've worked with for a long time talking about these topics. I'm most excited again about a development that happened during the pandemic. I think similar to what Lorelei was describing, in the context of members of Congress being able to do very simple things like file bills and add their name to a bill and co-sponsorship. These sound like very small things, but these are things that folks like us on the outside asked for decades. And there was always a reason that it couldn't be done, and it was never because it was technically not possible. It was always because there was this concern about authenticity or this concern about changing a process that has existed in the same way for 100 years. And then in the pandemic, necessity was the driver. And the Office of the House Clerk launched a new system now called the eHopper to accept digital text for introducing bills, launched in about 48 hours. And it was not perfect. And I think actually the beauty of it is that it wasn't perfect. It was a modified email system, but they did it quickly, and then they learned what worked, what didn't, how it was used, if people liked it. It turned out that the majority of the bills introduced actually came through the system, and so then they decided to put the resources into improving that system. So, oh my God, it's an agile Congress. It actually happened. And I think that that's so exciting, not just for the process that happened, but for the demonstration that it's possible for Congress to take a small step, learn from it, and then take a larger step, which is a perfect segue to Ken.
Thanks, hi, I'm Ken Ward. I'm the Director of New Digital Service in the House of Representatives. I was an undergrad here at Georgetown. My Village C, I have my dorm room here, my freshman dorm room is above us. So I worked on the Hill as a staffer as well. I went and worked for a couple technology companies and founded a company called Fireside 21, which is a software company that builds services for members of Congress. And I'm back on the Hill now for a year and a half. It's gone fast. And so we're really excited to be where we are today, really carrying the momentum of a lot of folks here and a lot of other folks not in the room that live the groundwork for this digital service. And right now it's just me, we're hiring, so we're early days still. We're very excited. So much has changed in the last 2 years, and I think like what's most impressive. I think I got to wave the flag for our Chief Administrative Office and the Clerk of the House, who have really brought online so many things. It's tough to list. Just streaming of hearings. The clerk has done great work, and actually have an email about that eHopper and the next version of it. And like Marcy said, there's so many things that have been in place for so long. And it's, some rules are hard rules. They're in the Constitution. But some rules are not really that firm. They're just the way we've worked for a long time. So the pandemic really reshuffled that dynamic. And similarly changed kind of the risk-taking approach. Government generally doesn't take big risks, doesn't invest in things unless they know what the outcomes are going to be. Certainly from a technology perspective, we think of building technology in a much different way than the government does. So that just assessment of what is risky and what is not risky and what are possibilities has really changed the equation, so to speak, of what the potential is for the future.
I'm Lisa Bogan. I came to Congress late in my career. My background, I worked in a tech company, and I worked in national security and foreign policy leaders in the past. I went to the Senate as a Congressional Innovation Fellow, and as I was leaving, the pandemic hit, and the founder of Tech Congress, who runs this fellowship for technologists to spend time on the Hill, called me and said, and I think it was the day after it was announced that the virus was spreading asymptomatically, and he called me and he said, interns are going office to office, so collecting wet signatures, and most of them in Congress are quite elderly, and the pandemic is really scary, and I feel like we could probably spin up something to kind of help augment the groundwork for decades and had been coming together and really pressuring Congress to move forward and trying to work on behalf of the American people, but also staffers, and they had this whole agenda that I just wasn't familiar with, and it was really exciting. And I loved getting to know everyone, and it was sort of a treasure hunt, finding who were really like-minded folks on the Hill who cared about these issues, and connecting with them. Marcy connected me with somebody who connected me with Ken, and I found out he had this great team, and so we hired 3 fellows originally. We had a 4th join us later, and we deployed them to different institutional offices because I'd been in the Senate and we had digital signatures there, and so when the Modernization Committee was saying, well, we might create our own digital signatures platform, I thought, well, we already have one, so we could probably just move it over here. And so it was sort of that weird institutional connectivity that became really valuable in the time of crisis. So we were based on the Select Committee at Modernization, and then the fellows, we had 2 who had the great honor of getting to work with Ken, and one went to the clerk's office and worked on the e-hopper, which was digitally submitting legislation. They were incredible engineers, designers, technologists, and they did such an amazing job. But it was also an opportunity for all of us to sort of learn how the institution works, why we don't have cloud computing in the Senate versus the House, sort of the underlying pieces that I hadn't been familiar with. So getting to see the arc of this journey toward an actual congressional digital service that Ken leads has been really exciting and educational for me. So I felt really fortunate to get to know all of you, and I'm so excited. Ken is fantastic, so I'm excited for what he does with it. And I got the opportunity to work with Devika, which is amazing. She joined me later, partway through the modernization, when we were both on the modernization committee, and your background, I would say, but it's really incredible, and you brought so much to the team, so it was really fun to get to work with you too.
I'm Devika. I was in Italy on the modernization committee, but in my regular capacity, I'm a product manager at 18F. Which Erin helped co-found. 18F is a version of a digital service within the executive branch, within the GSA, and I've been there for less than 2 years, so I've spent most of my time outside of government, outside of the federal government. But I had an opportunity to spend 8 months working with Ken and Marcy Weasel on the Select Committee of Congress. And I think for me the most eye-opening thing, first stepping into the federal government at 18F and then stepping into the committee was seeing how, even as someone who builds things within the federal government, being able to sort of connect what we were doing to policy. And I think once I saw that, it was hard to unsee that, because you kind of see how, okay, well, we're working on this modernization thing, and we're building it or fixing it, but that's because of these 4 things that happen, these policies, and these regulations. And then I think once I saw that, I was like, well, we could go around, we could go agency to agency and help, I don't want to say fix, but I think help build capacity also of folks to learn what product is and human-centered design. But maybe there's also a way to inject some of this into policy or into law. And I have a tech math background, I don't know my law, but I felt that spending time in Congress was essential. The first Tech Congress has technologists who are working on policy. But I think what was cool about the digital service and what Ken's doing, I had a chance to work with him for the second half of my detail, is these folks are going to be, I think of them as brand ambassadors for all the buzzwords, human-centered design and agile and product. Again, not necessarily working on policy, but I think there could be a cool osmosis that happens of changing, influencing staff, learning how to create better outcomes through service delivery and customer experience. And I think my dream is that sort of practice within the House can then maybe influence how federal policy is created. So I have lots to say on that, but I'll leave it.
Perfect segue, because following on from the dream, we're going to talk about Congress of the future. So say if we reconvene this in 10 years, Congress has built a more robust Article I authority for itself and created a healthier balance between itself, the legislative branch, the first branch, and the executive branch, the White House and the agencies. It's funding itself, it's using data and technology to expand and improve deliberation and oversight. It's a better informed, more responsive, and effective lawmaking body. And we'll assume here that the Senate has gotten on board in its own unique way. Its fleet of messenger pigeons has retired, and it's moving into its own form of modernization. This is an important note, is like, when you get to the Hill, and certainly when you're looking at it from the outside, you think the House and Senate all coordinate and share everything. They are like two different civilizations. And the House is right now quite a bit ahead of the Senate on modernization, but the Senate is going to get interested in the next year, I guarantee you. So, what are a few items in your sort of grand vision for Congress of the future? Marcy, could you also mention the pacing problem? And like, that's a really important piece of context.
Sure. So the pacing problem that Lorelei just asked about is a concept that I wrote about with some co-authors in a report from the American Political Science Association, recommendations to the Select Committee on Modernization. We stole the concept of a pacing problem from scientific literature to talk about Congress having actually 3 pacing problems. So the idea that tech and develops, if you're following Moore's law or some other measure, roughly exponentially, and policy develops at best case scenario linearly, and often not even that. And so you have an increasing gap every year as the development continues. We talked about 3 pacing problems being the external pacing problem, which is Congress's ability to understand and act on changes in society, so basically regulating tech or other changes in society. Congress is often substantively behind in understanding what's going on and how to act. The inter-branch pacing problem, which is, at least in recent years, the executive branch has a whole lot more funding capability, and Congress is investing in tech in the executive branch and not in itself. So you have this outpace in the executive branch and Congress's ability to even keep up and know what's happening there and fulfill its role in overseeing the executive branch. And then there's the internal pacing problem, which is Congress's ability to use modern tools to do its job, which is primarily what we're talking about today. But my dream for a future Congress is that Congress addresses the internal pacing problem and then turn itself to the interbranch and external pacing problems through what you mentioned as something that I call outcomes-driven policy. So the idea that you have a better data structure within the federal programs, there's the ability to draw conclusions from programmatic data that is accessible and standardized, privacy protecting, and all of the beautiful buzzwords, but that Congress is able to write into law the goals of legislation and set parameters for measuring success towards those goals, and then GAO or some other entity helps Congress in real time know how the implementation of those policies is adhering to the goals, adjust and calibrate based on learnings of different implementation structures, and have essentially a constantly improving policy structure. That's my dream.
That sounds good.
That's beautiful.
10 years?
Well, I think to build on that, I think what I'd like to see in 10 years is just a lot more collaboration across traditional institutional entities. Congress internally, like what I do with technology and what my colleagues do, works very similarly to what you see how Congress works legislatively. There's committees of jurisdiction, and they own it, and they hand it over here to the next jurisdiction, and they all kind of work independently. We have the architect of the Capitol that owns some stuff, there's the CAO that owns other things, the clerk that owns legislative things, not committee legislative things, that's somebody else. So there become all these silos of people kind of working independently. And something that the pandemic has facilitated, just remote Zoom meetings, is collaborating more so. And the Tech Congress fellows help with that. Devika helped with that. We have technologists in all these different groups that now are starting to talk more together and collaborate more on best practices and really try to think about how they can work across these kind of traditional silos. And private sector of an operating model, you have a product and you do a pipeline. There's no barriers to hand off between a customer and somebody doing support or an engineer actually building product. It's all kind of one feedback loop of information, feedback, and then pushing new product. And right now, we're not quite there yet, right? There are barriers to those handoffs, even in how we deliver basic IT services still in house. But again, we've moved mountains over the past couple of years, so I'm very encouraged by how that can change. And as far as our digital service role, I think we hopefully can hit on all three of those buckets. Certainly, we're focused more on that internal. How do we deliver IT? How does the Congress operate? And hopefully, we can lead by example and open up some doors for how that might change policy outcomes as well.
10 years from now.
10 years from now, I echo all of those ideas, and Marcy and I have nerded out on impact and outcomes because I felt like when I was drafting legislation, I was really drafting based on assumptions and just like, let's hope this does what we think it will do. And in fact, I'm now a research fellow at the Technology and Public Purpose Program at the Belfer Center at Harvard, and I interviewed somebody as part of my research, and they said, well, if we knew what policy was going to do, like, nothing would pass. And they were writing legislation, and I was like, oh, great. So I think in 10 years, I would like to see Marcy's vision come to fruition. I would also like to see strengthening of the oversight capacity. You find all of these GAO reports that I was involved in some Afghanistan evacuation work, and we had a lot of problems that we faced that GAO had flagged 12 years ago and said this needs to be addressed, and nobody did anything. And that happened a lot on the Hill. You would write a letter to the State Department, for example, to follow up on something, and somebody else had written a letter about it, but there's no feedback loop. We didn't know what had happened. They may have communicated with one person who had their signature on the letter, but not with the other 4 offices who were also interested in that issue. And then so there's like this documentation problem or feedback loop issue. And so I'd like to see more accountability and follow up. But again, I think part of it's just Congress is stretched so thin. This isn't a criticism. It's just I think a reality of having an institution that sort of had to delegate away a lot of its authority based on the reluctance to fund itself. So I'd like to see those 2 things for sure.
Oh,
Just-
and I also.
So just for the audience, GAO stands for Government Accountability Office, and it's this tremendous reservoir of information and advisory capacity for Congress. So it's GAO.gov.
Great clarification. And one more thing that I had mentioned before, and I think we're getting better, but I think Congress should still be more representative of a broader population. I think the pandemic highlighted the lack of access so many people have, particularly those with disabilities and from different socioeconomic and other backgrounds, demographic backgrounds. So I think it's really important that Congress look like the United States, and so I'm hoping it becomes reversed over time.
Yeah, I think building on that, or building on what Lynn said, I think, and Ken mentioned collaboration, Marcy mentioned kind of, I'll paraphrase, an iterative policy. I think it'd be really cool if more federal, subject matter experts could not just have a seat at the table, but participate in parts of policy making. And like I mentioned, we often implement policy or the outcomes of policy, but I think it's hard. And we see a lot of kind of the good and bad of various policy decisions, but there's not really a formal feedback loop, especially within. I'll say that in my corner of government, how do you do a retro on a policy, right? Like, that's not really the thing. And by retro, I mean just a retrospective, like asking, did this work? This law was written 50 years ago. Like, okay, how do we test it? So yeah, I think my dream would be in some collaborative way, really just I think through social convenings, through relationships, and maybe more spaces for people, for staff and federal folks to meet. Just kind of having that relationship so that you can you have people to ask, you can learn, I think, through a lot of those social engagements. But yeah, when that policy is built and when it's being considered, bringing folks to the table and also rethinking maybe who an expert is and what an expert looks like. I think often when congressional staff, there's a process. You have to go through ledger affairs, and ledger affairs kind of picks people within agencies, and usually the most senior folks. And the senior folks, they might not necessarily be the doers. They might not be kind of closest to the actual implementation of policy. So I think those two things, of more collaboration, but also inviting people in the room that might not, be the kind of stereotypical expert.
Thank you. And just as a note on convening, is Tech and Society Initiative offices are at 500 First Street, just down the street from the Senate. So hopefully that'll be a place, that's an example of a place that sort of adjacent organizations, especially universities and other sharing information organizations, can do that convening on the Hill. And now back on the Hill, Congress is open back up. So I have one more question, and then we can open it up for questions from the audience. So the Modernization of Congress also has a looming dark side that we need to acknowledge. In society, we've seen the limits of using advertising platforms in civic discourse. The business model of social media tends to scale conspiracy and accelerates angry reactions for engagement, whereas democratic institutions require contemplation, I have to say discernment, because here we are at a Jesuit institution, and shared space, scaling up and down, sharing from the beginning to the end, collaboration and sharing. How do we avoid the mishaps and peril that we've seen in the last decade of the internet? And how do we learn from those hard experiences to protect Congress and strengthen democracy?
To me?
Yeah.
Thought about this a lot. I don't have the answer, but I have a few suggestions. On the one hand, I would really like to see Congress better enforce its communications policies. There are official accounts that members get that are maintained by their taxpayer-funded staff that should not be places where conspiracy theories or political attacks are circulated. You can do that with your campaign account. But Congress enforces its own rules. Twitter doesn't enforce those rules. So if that's going to be enforced and these official accounts are going to be sources of information, Congress has to enforce those rules. The rules exist, they just need to enforce them. So that's a baby one. The other suggestion that I have on this front is Congress actually funds and holds incredible nonpartisan information about policies. The Congressional Research Service, their job is to explain anything to congressional staffers who ask. And they are amazing at it. They do a tremendous job. And many, thank goodness, over the past several years, many Congressional Research Service reports are public, but they are still dense. And I would love to see, and CRS does not have a public outreach arm department person that works on sharing this wonderful, neutral, informed information that Congress pays, that the American people pay to have developed. I would love to see much more investment into CRS with a direct mandate to make some of this information, especially information about things that are particularly hot in the news or that offices are hearing about, to put out understandable, plain language explanations that are easily digestible to the public, and not just put them out, make it available via API, have a public information officer whose job it is to make sure that people are understanding these concepts, and be a source of factual, neutral, understandable information.
I'm trying to dodge this one. I think, I don't have as well formed ideas on this particular concept, but I think on a lot of these efforts that we're building upon today kind of started from kind of the data transparency efforts of a decade ago, and I think transparency continues to probably be the best way to hold folks accountable, and that can apply to this kind of communications model as well. There are rules and there is some transparency, but there could potentially be more transparency. I do kind of pontificate on things like how to do the census better, how to do drawing district maps better, how to do primary elections better, but I'm not an expert on those things. I'll defer to someone else.
Great suggestions.
making sure that we are asking a lot of questions and trying to see if we're asking the right questions. A lot of the time on the Hill, there's a rush to get to the right answer. What's the right legislative answer? What's the right fix to this or that? And I think instilling a value in the question formation process and expanding those questions, I've learned that from a colleague of mine, I think is really important. The other thing, going back to my oversight point, I really think it would be helpful if we diversified witnesses. I know there are a lot of really good reasons why the witness pool has been so narrow over time, and I apologize, I can't remember the data source. Anybody remembers the group that did an analysis of witnesses before Congress? But you know, in some instances, the same person would testify for 20 years on the same issue, but for the same committees, and that's fine. They're an expert, but it would be great to see other witnesses as well, and especially if you're trying to do oversight on a particular industry, and you only invite the industry government relations people to testify on that issue. To me, that's flawed. And so I know Congress wants to bring people in who they trust and who they can reliably expect to be there or they've worked with in the past, but I do think spreading that out would actually be really helpful in terms of making the accountability process better and mitigating some of the harms that come because of this sort of capture of information.
Yeah, I would say that, kind of thinking about data and where data comes from, and as much as I think a lot of policymaking can be improved by, more collaboration between the branches, I also think that, one of Marcy's colleagues talks a lot about how casework, congressional casework being kind of, if you're a constituent or a member, you go, if you have a problem, you can go to a member of Congress for help with a federal agency, and kind of thinking about that kind of in aggregate as data, and thinking about who are the people, why are people going to their congressional for help? What was the journey before that, and what are they asking for? I think there's a lot of interesting insights that Congress could collect within itself. If it, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on standardizing, what do you consider, what are the definitions, but I think just having a way to assess what's happening kind of in real time. I did a lot of user research with congressional caseworkers, and it was amazing how they kind of could sense a hotspot or an issue before it became an issue, just because they would intuitively see patterns in the type of complaint. And so you can really understand, and for Congress to own that information source and not have a lag, the news or anything, but just being able to kind of address issues more quickly before they escalate. I think that would be really helpful for the institution, so it has its own data source for making decisions.
So everybody think of your questions, and I'm just going to let the panelists ask each other or clarify or add anything that you'd like before we go to Q&A. Very good.
I'll ask Ken. So what Devika just described, Congressional Digital Services, please do that.
Well, we started, which is really exciting. And here on this panel, we kind of see an iterative approach to this. We've ideated on these concepts for years and years and years, and then we prototyped with the Tech Congress Fellows, and then we kind of did iteration one with Devika coming on as a product manager with some of the research we did. And so, that research is critical. Sharing that around all the different institutional entities, which are typically siloed, is, I think, critical. And so I think that can lay the foundation for a lot of great outcomes.
I just think of the notion of structured data in a place where people write drafts of bills on menus and napkins, and the whole place is just sort of the nation's water cooler. So how do you create structured data in a very human organization is going to be a challenge. I think if we can just sort of get 30% of the way there, that would be great. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask? If you could just sort of identify yourself and maybe address the panelists that you'd like to answer, we'll all take a stab at it.
Sure, I'm Michael Boland. I hope I'm the oldest person here. I worked on the Hill for 10 years, a long time ago. So, some of that.
Thank you.
Thank
CRS reports are fabulous. I love that comment. There was a private company that came on for free and created something called everycrsreport.org. They actually had to fight with CRS. So I think part of the change needs to be like the old joke about how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Just one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. Okay, so CRS has to want to change. If they would open themselves up to innovation by others, controlling, and they should control their product, then their product could find an audience, including on the staff, because the hurried nature of the work has never changed. And I've done some research on this, I've offered up. The number one way a staffer goes to find information is a Google search, which when you know how Google works, and it works very well, it doesn't search the relevant source. It searches the most abundant link on that exact question frame. But if you're asking like how many bridges in Pennsylvania are considered to be structurally deficient, it won't give you the right answer. The second most common way of searching is to skip it. Just go without it. Let someone else do it, or just, I'm gonna hurry anyway. So there's a demand for quick primary source information, and the supply of answers isn't made ready for that.
Well, I'll just say that there's a congressional hackathon all afternoon today in the Capitol, and this is the kind of challenge that gets taken up by groups and tries to, like, you're right, an advertising platform was never gonna be okay for democracy to do civic search. And when staff are so carried and rushed and overwhelmed, they either do without or often go to lobbyists who are solid information sources but very narrowly self-interested.
Right.
And so what do we do about that? That's part of the challenge for sure.
I would just encourage you guys to keep working on this, because there's a big payoff if something clicks.
Thank you, thank you.
If I could just say, there are some changes underfoot in that regard. You know, there's kind of this, kind of a fundamental tenet of digital services is self-forming teams and managing your own product pipeline. And the traditional operating model is more top-down of here's money to do this, executing on a project. And so there are some changes underfoot to move from this kind of project-by-project operating model to a more product management operating model, which I think can kind of address that.
I like that.
CRS staffers, you know, and I see this all throughout, don't feel empowered to make the change that they know that should be done, because this is how we've done it, this is how we've worked. So I think, you know, again, that might be a way we can be a leader for more modern methodologies for better outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you. CRS for our viewing audience stands for Congressional Research Service. You can find it at congress.gov. Sarah?
Yeah, Sarah Schnapp from USA Press. So I was wondering, there've been so many improvements that have been made, I'll stand up, right in the back. So many improvements that you talked about that have been made during the pandemic. And a lot of them benefiting Congress. And certainly there are champions of congressional modernization in Congress. But to get support from your work, you need support within Congress. What areas do you feel like Congress broadly needs to like level up its knowledge or skills in order to be able to modernize? Like, what's the next phase of kind of internal advocacy or the knowledge development we need to spread amongst broadly amongst congressional members?
So the first step is going to keep the momentum of the Select Committee on Modernization going in some institutional format. There's a discussion about how that's going to happen. It will exist some way, so keep your eye on that, but I'll turn it over to the panel to answer. What are the next sort of institutional transformations?
Well, I'll just flag that Tech Congress, the organization that the Digital Service Fellowship, was founded by Travis Morse, who That, I think, brings a lot of different perspectives to policy, and the Hill is a great training ground for that, but I think bringing outside expertise that has that cross-disciplinary background would be really useful.
I think something that I learned when I was on my TCL was kind of the experience of staff, who are often, kind of, always behind the scenes and not really kind of, their stories are never told, but, oftentimes they're the ones kind of running the show, kind of behind the scenes, and so I think seeing how the modernization committee surfaced staff experience and advocated for more professionalization of staff so that Congress could be a place where you could have a career, kind of at all levels, you could enter at all levels. I think, that's not necessarily one skill set, but I think it's kind of management of senior staff and if Congress was your first job, if it was your first job as an intern, it's kind of all you know, and so you're limited by kind of like the professional experience that you might have there. And so I know folks in the CAO are working on kind of developing a curriculum so that a standard curriculum of sorts, so that your experience isn't a function of who you happen to be staffed with. I think that would be huge for the institution, because then you have folks who are there, that can be there, can afford to be there for more than a couple of years. You retain knowledge and information, and I think that, of course, you'll see a quality change, I think, in policy and outcomes.
Marcy, did you have a-
Let's take a look at it.
Okay, so I saw somebody raise their hand here. Go ahead.
I'm a master's student at Florida School of Public Policy. My name is Lisa, and I'm taking courses with Professor Cavaleris on design design. Being more familiar with these topics. So one of the things we talk about a lot is how USDS got started in 18F and how we drew heavily from the UK version of the US Civil Service. So I'm curious what inspiration you take from international communities on that topic, and how you connect with them or talk to them, share, collaborate, if at all.
Great question, yes. Definitely taking inspiration across the globe for different parts. One thing is, Congress is Congress, it's not a parliament. And that's one of the hardest things, is that it's not a top-down system at all. It's this wicked problem of 141 offices and then 100 and all kinds of other admin and subject matter offices. So definitely pieces of it putting together from different countries, and there's international organizations, there's the CrowdBlock catalog that NYU put out, that GovLab. But go ahead, and Marcy, do you have comments on like international inspiration? You've been really active in other countries as well.
Yeah, so I learn a lot from work that's happening in different places, and I think in lots of ways there are examples of governments that are much further ahead of the U.S., especially in the legislative context, and some of it comes back to just this structural system of the U.S. Congress versus a parliament that has legislation that starts in a ministry versus needing an individual member to come up with the idea or the committee. So it's tough to have kind of the surfacing of issues and the expert knowledge within the legislative body. But it will be cliche, but I think there's so much to learn from Estonia. I think New Zealand has actually been very advanced. The European system itself, of course, there's lots of great examples of like citizens' assemblies or other collaborative projects that the European Union has sponsored. I think one of the biggest things that they do well in the European Union is they fund research and they fund these kinds of technologies, which the U.S. is still very far behind in providing public sources of funding to do this work. So there's a lot to learn from governments around the world.
And I'll add that for our digital service report, the Tech Congress, we did a lot of scoping at the very beginning. We spoke with President Timmons, who's of Estonia, former president of Estonia, about how they developed their digital model. We talked to a lot of former European Parliament members. We talked to scrambling, but those that had done previous digital service work in the past really weathered the pandemic quite well. Like Spain had already changed its rules and had developed an app in order to allow women who were giving birth to vote remotely. There are a number of examples like that. You can look in the report, but I will say that Congress, as Lorelai said, is completely unique. And so when we talked to a lot of USDS folks, they were super helpful and gave us tons of feedback. And I remember somebody saying, and this is great, this is a great suggestion, well, you should hire an anthropologist to go on to your team to help with this effort. And it made sense to understand the culture, et cetera. But Congress is so different that we really we knew we should start small. We knew we couldn't do, it didn't have the mandate from above, it didn't have the presidential mandate to go in and sort of just walk in and say, well, the president told us to fix this. So I think having a different approach, we deliberately picked fellows who were kind of flexible and able to sort of adapt to any kind of community, had a lot of emotional intelligence, as well as brilliance, and then, you know, technical brilliance. And we really tried to look for people who were okay with the kind of unique beast that Congress is. So that's sort of our approach to that.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, for better or worse, the executive branch is out ahead of us in Congress. But Deb Call, you know, did helped with a lot of this research, but yes, you know, we're learning from others who came before us, including some in the room who've been on this path. And I think that's essential, you know. And as Liesl was saying, you know, where we live in the Congress is different than how the UK system works, and different how USDS and ATNF live in the executive branch. And maybe more similar to some state level digital services perhaps. But there's just a wealth of like learning each other. How should we work? How should we hire? Who should we hire? How can we be flexible and pivot with contracting vehicles to bring on special, you know, really brilliant people for particular use cases. So we've learned a lot. I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add. So before I joined government, I spent a lot of time living in India and spent some time in Southeast Asia. And what I've been drawing on recently is how a lot of India and Singapore and other large Asian countries have designed or architected their government, and how you know, especially in the executive branch or in our agency, we're thinking a lot about customer experience and executive order, and kind of the spirit of it being how do you create or design a consistent experience across government in a kind of very decentralized federalist society. So it's sort of like this design challenge of you kind of have to allow states and agencies to be autonomous in some sense, but there's a very strong cultural element to decentralization, but outwardly, how do you make it seem like it's kind of cohesive and like people are working together? And so, yeah, I think that the work that folks in India have done around kind of designing government as a stack, thinking about identity and then kind of building on top of identity, so that you can enable you know, services to be delivered in like a consistent way, no matter where you enter. Yeah, I think some of those case studies have been on my mind.
Thank you, and I think we have time for, Taylor?
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Campbell, Director of Program at the Beck Center. Sort of related to the last piece of the meeting, I'm curious about how the constituent experience is taken into consideration in your language work, and like what you might have in mind as a goal or a dream on that side of things that was not touched on yet, and really wanting to just take the last few minutes to hear your thoughts on what the constituent experience is.
Constituent experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, when we talk about some of these buzzwords of, you know, human centered design, for example, it's that. So that's the end user. That's who we're delivering services to. And the executive branch has a lot of forward-facing services like that. The legislative branch does as well, although it's kind of through the member entity relationship. But there are a lot of things that Congress delivers directly to their constituents, and they're kind of an untapped voice in many ways, but we're working to do better with them. But certainly, internal internal to our operations, member offices like the proxy and we're looking to deploy, better research methodologies to capture and respond more quickly.
Well, and just quickly on that, I would say, there's a bit of a challenge right now, because the main thing that a constituent is told if they want to change something, or if they have an issue, is contact your member of Congress. But the actual functioning of Congress right now doesn't empower rank and file members to do much. So contact your member of Congress is not the kind of change-making action that it has been in the past. And, various forms of advocacy have also diluted the impact of that. And so you have this kind of, do we really want to make that the call to action when someone's engaging if it is not an actual direct link to the action having an impact? And I think it's important for us to start to be really honest about that. And members want to be honest about that too, to have higher quality engagement on the things that they can do something about, and be very open about how the process works. So I think there's a civic education piece that has to happen. Congress just reintroduced earmarks, which some people think is terrible, but is actually members of Congress able to make recommendations about how money should be spent in their district. And as a part of this new earmarks process, there is a priority placed on community support. So it really is kind of the reintroduction of members of Congress rank and file being able to do anything for their constituents, which is awesome. And that's really an opportunity for engagement that I hope they're going to double down on. Then the other piece I would just say is we've worked with, in a couple of instances with committees to have a more open process. Lorelei's written about this, to participate in the bill making process. I like to say back at the ingredient picking point, not at the we just baked a cake, how do you like it point. And committees are where the bills are getting written. So if the committees actually can have a process to get engagement from constituents in a broad, diverse group of constituents, that's actually bringing people in where they can have impact and I think not fueling a cycle of apathy.
Thank you. I mean, just the potential right now for not just having a sort of shared vision of the future, but for actively creating that together as a whole of nation is before us. The states and state legislatures are laboratories. Other countries, Taiwan, Estonia, you mentioned, are these tremendous leaders in this around the world. Is how do you include this great, vast reservoir of humans living out there who really want eyes on the prize to strengthen democracy and work together and share. And I would just say like our chances now, and hopefully this convening today has been sort of a pivotal moment of laying out the next decade of challenge of how we do this together. So thank you everybody for your questions. If you have more that you'd like to add, use the Congress Arrives optimistic hashtag. And keep an eye on Congress Select Committee on Modernization. Everybody up here is going to be willing to be helpful and give you feedback and tell you what's going on. And thanks for showing up today on a rainy day in April. So I'm going to give a hand to the participants in the audience.